From Microbe TV, this is Matters Microbial, a podcast about the wonders of microbiology, microbiologists, and microbial centrism. This episode was recorded on January 9th, 2025. Hello, Micronauts, and welcome to our Quality Quorum for today. I'm your host, Dr. Mark Martin, Associate Professor of Biology at the University of Puget Sound in Tacoma, Washington. Today is the 74th episode of Matters Microbial. Can you believe it? So many thanks to my fellow microbial enthusiasts as guests, as well as every listen and/or view from you. I hope that each episode makes every one of you more of a micronaut, and they each spark microbial joy in yours truly. Thank you all. Again, happy Microbial 2025. Since I am currently in phased retirement, I have no teaching assignments this coming semester. Hopefully, this will allow me to learn some new lab techniques, put on some LuxArt sessions at other institutions, and even write a book about my view of microbiology. I might even get to travel a bit to visit other microbiologists. One of the central themes in this podcast is promoting microbial literacy. Let's face it, microbiology is sometimes seen with a negative bias. It's everywhere in the media these days. For example, consider my examples of #devil microbes, where all microbes are assumed to be disease-causing and thus bad. Or #angel microbes, where all microbes are oversold as being universally good or helpful. The truth, sadly, is #meh microbes. Most microbes don't really care much about us one way or the other. The artwork for these images was done by the superlative Maggie Middleton. Or ask most people in your life their opinion of the term germ. It has a truly negative reflexive response in most people. Interestingly, Louis Pasteur, who popularized the term, only meant a bit of life, which he used in his battles in the 19th century against the concept of spontaneous generation. This is why I like to make students think about wheat germ before asking their response to the word germ. As you can see here, I've combined the two. It is critical to teach others to see the microbial world without the negativity we find all too often. For this reason, I am so very happy to welcome Dr. Jessica Coates of the Biology Department of Spelman College to the podcast. Welcome to the Quality Quorum today, Jess.
Hi, thank you, Mark. I'm so excited to be here today.
I'm so grateful that you made the time. January can get kind of difficult, I know, so thanks so much.
It's a microbiologist's favorite time. We've got respiratory virus season and the holidays, so lots going on.
Oh, I have such fun at Thanksgiving. There's a rule in my household. I'm not allowed to talk about microbiology at Thanksgiving.
That sounds like an okay holiday. It'd be a little better with microbe talk, but I could understand that.
So I think that you have a very interesting approach to trying to promote microbial literacy and actually the way that you've sometimes described it as combating microbial misinformation. And I think that's a wonderful approach. I think a good place to start with this, since you do it in your microbiology class, is give listeners and viewers kind of a synopsis of your class, the class size, what kind of preparation they have, that sort of thing.
Wonderful. Okay, so I am a professor at Spelman College. We're a liberal arts, all women's college, and we're also an historically Black college. Our class size, we typically like to keep an 11-to-1 student ratio. However, as you may know, in these past few years, HBCUs have gotten an increased enrollment, which was one of the reasons why I was really interested in implementing a podcast instead of a term paper at the end of the semester. So my class sizes can vary from relatively small to about 9 students to upwards of 20. The class is taught as a studio course, so they have lecture, lab, and recitation all in one session. And it is taught in the fall and spring on Wednesdays and Fridays as an 8 a.m. class. So 8 a.m. early in the morning, they have about 2 hours and 45 minutes of me and micro. So I try to make it as entertaining as I can for the students, because I know as a college student, 8 a.m. is a very dreaded course you have to take. So
everywhere I've ever been or ever taught, organic chemistry is taught at 8 a.m. I don't know what that is, but
what? Oh, wow. That would be
yeah,
fun.
but I salute you teaching micro at 8 a.m.
And a lot of my students
So
are actually juniors and seniors, so they're taking their orgo and their physics at the same time. So they have a really heavy workload that we're trying to make sure that we don't overwhelm them too much.
So one of the things that is appealing about what you're describing is for many years, I've been doing a certain degree of mixing creative approaches with my classes. And sometimes that turns into artwork. Other times it's poetry. And, some folks kind of, they kind of look down their nose at it. And I honestly believe that when there's a creative approach, the students are more invested in what they do. I believe they work harder. And any critique that one can make of this creative approach, I think, is offset by the fact that you have those kinds of problems with more traditional forms of assessing knowledge. So I would argue, I've had absolutely, I'll give you a good example. I had a student several years ago who made a claymation video of type 6 secretory systems in Vibrio cholera. And when you look up type 6 secretory systems on YouTube, his video comes up on the first page, right? So, of course, you have to do all kinds of quality control, but I believe that's something that we're going to talk about today. So what I'm hearing is you have a small class, and this is always amazing when I went to UCLA as an undergraduate. So I went to graduate school with people that had also been an undergrad with me, and we had never met. But that doesn't happen in small liberal arts colleges at all. And so I'm really quite impressed. So your idea in place of a term paper is, and I've done things like PowerPoints or optional creative stuff, but you're having them do a straight up podcast. Can you talk about the process?
Yes. So they start in groups, depending on the size of the class, from 3 to 5. And one of their first tasks is to decide who's going to do what, right? So we begin to explore the fact that a podcast isn't just turn on a camera, record yourself, and upload it. There's multiple different steps, including planning, writing, coordinating, that have to go into it. And I typically invite a guest speaker who's involved in the podcasting world to kind of share some of their experiences with the students so it can help them really start to sit and think about who should be which role. And so once they've decided who should be which role, each person then has different things that they're doing on a weekly basis. We have a script writer who's researching the topic. They're getting their topic approved. They're deciding if they want to have guests. What is everyone's schedule like? Because we have to coordinate getting these things together. We also need someone who's a sound engineer, someone who can edit. And guess what? Someone who can make sure everything gets done on time so that Dr. Coates doesn't take any points off for tardiness or lateness, right? And so they're doing this over a course of about 4 weeks at the end of the course after they've gotten the idea of basic microbiology. And we're really starting to explore what I like to call the super fun things about infections and abnormal case studies. So they're really starting to really dive into micro as it relates to their day-to-day lives. And so I think it's a really good opportunity for them to see what's on the news, to bring that into the classroom, and then to think to themselves, hey, how do we do this? How do we write the script? How do we say the names in the script? Because it's one thing to write Staphylococcus aureus. It's another thing to know how to say it. And then how can we make this a product that will make Dr. Coates laugh? Because whenever she laughs, she adds extra points to our grade. So little things like that they're doing. And I find it very enjoyable. I think they do as well.
I think that sounds wonderful. I should probably send you, I may post this.
Okay.
But my students last semester actually had me do a Gen Z description of our class.
Oh.
And there's nothing funnier than an old guy using that language. Come on, we've seen it on YouTube before.
Yes.
But
Even
again, I
myself.
love the humor aspect. Now it's true, and Jess, I have to say, sometimes I will get people, and it's okay, who don't care for that approach, or I've been called flippant more than once, but guilty. But here's the thing: I think that there are many ways to learn, and just as there are students who don't care for my flamboyance, because that's what it is, but there are other students who really like it. But no matter what you do, there's going to be that situation. What
Mhm.
always works is for you to be authentic as an instructor and authentic as a student.
Oh, I
And
love
that's what
that.
impresses me about what I'm hearing so far. I love the stepwise business too.
Because I will say one of the things that students really need help with, especially at that stage, is project planning. They see a deadline and they like to wait until maybe a day or two before, thinking that's enough time, but it's really just showing them that there's a thought process that goes into this and we have to be able to coordinate accordingly. So,
I had an experience recently where I had given some structure to an assignment. Very briefly, when I have found years ago that if you do a term paper with students on a particular microbiological topic, sometimes they would get lost in the verbiage and not really understand it deeply. So I call their term paper a microbiography because flippant. Then I also have them do a one-page version for an English major, that is to say, a non-STEM major. I call that a nanobiography, and they universally hate doing it. But if I bribe them with candy and positivity and they do it, it really helps their term paper, because there's something about putting it in a less technical, jargony way that really helps them understand. I think jargon can be camouflaged, and I really like to work both sides. And also because we have an obligation to be able to present what we do to people that are outside the sciences.
that's one of the things I at least try to teach the students. We listen to quite a few microbiology related, well, at least 3 microbiology related podcasts throughout the semester, from when they know nothing in micro to when they're finally finished. And I also always ask them to critique it and say, well, what would you understand if you hadn't taken this class? Would you have continued to listen to this podcast if I wasn't forcing you to do it? And then think about that when they're creating their own podcast. Because it's like you said, it's one
Absolutely.
thing to have all the jargon and be able to read the words out from the script. It's another thing to engage the people who are listening and to actually make it something that they understand and want to hear.
So your audience, do you give them latitude in who their audience is supposed to be?
I do not. So I maybe I should, but typically I tell them the audience is going to be their grandmother or someone in their family who's, when they go home, they want to know, well, what have you been doing this semester? And then if they listen to that podcast, they would say, oh, wow, not only did I learn something, but I can tell that you're learning something in the classroom as well.
I really applaud this, because I could see you doing it other ways, but I applaud this because I look around, and as you heard in the introduction, I'm appalled at what people think they know about microbiology. We don't have to walk through the pandemic to have that discussion, I know.
Oh,
But it's all because of a lack of an ability to express scientific thinking to people who aren't trained in it. And I think it's critical. We have no problem with that when it comes to getting our cars worked on, right? We tell the mechanic, explain what you're trying to do. Well, same thing for us. So I really think this is a great idea. Can you tell me what percentage of their grade is based on this?
it is 5% of their grade. So it's not as big as exams. And
Mhm.
it's not as big as the lab notebook, but it can really make or break your grade. So for a lot of students, it's the end of the semester. Some of them are like, I really need that A. The majority of them actually are like, I really need that A. So they're still kind of tuned in and ready to try to do what they can to get as high as the grade as they can on the podcast.
No, I think it's a really good idea. Sometimes I worry. I mean, I at one point I wanted to require students to do a creative project, and I had a bunch of students come to me. Complain's a strong word. They came to me expressing concerns because they are so negative about themselves. And I want to circle back on that later. And that's one of the outcomes, as far as I'm concerned, is having the students gain some confidence in their ability to present and understand complex ideas. So most of the time I do things that are extra credit, and that's fine too. Everyone has a right to do things differently. I really like your approach. Are there a couple of examples of the kinds of things that they've done?
Yes. So we've had some really interesting things that they've picked. Some of them picked the impact of vaginal steaming on the vaginal microbiome. One group tried to do the connection, or didn't try. They actually did a very amazing job of connecting sexually transmitted infections with eye health. A lot of students take this because it's a pre-health careers requirement. So I have a lot of dental students. So I got things like healthy mouth microbes, healthy body, really wonderful and fun things. And this past semester, we actually had a few bird flu podcasts just because it's been on the news so much. So they wanted to kind of dive into it themselves.
Do you have a go-to series of I'm not asking to include mine. Do you have a go-to series of podcasts that you recommend the students look at first?
So actually, I try to do it double-edged. So I always have them listen to podcasts right before exams. Our first exam is on skin infections. So anytime I can find a podcast that's about dermatology or staph, anything like that. Our second unit is on foodborne pathogens. So we actually listen to a podcast on ice cream and listeria and contamination, things like that. And then for the very last option, I let them pick their own. I tell them it doesn't even have to be microbiology, but it should be something health related. And it should be appropriate, of course, to share in a classroom setting. And so a lot of them actually end up picking influencers over scientists when they're picking their health related podcast. So I thought that was something that was kind of interesting, and also kind of thinking about how is that information being disseminated? You want to make sure it's a good source and a reliable source. And it's something I hope they start to learn as they're assembling sources for their own podcast to make sure they're giving reliable information out.
I think that that's really critical. From time to time, I will get students who will be very interested in the role of the microbiome and fill in the blank. There's certain neurological differences that have been implicated as due to change in microbiome, let alone things like even obesity, where there's a lot more complexity to it than you would expect when you would just go surf YouTube to see. So this idea of critical thinking is and that brings us, I think, to a really important concept that you brought up with this combating microbial misinformation, which I really like.
Yes, that is my favorite part of it. I ask them when they're thinking about their topics to include any common misconceptions or myths and be able to evaluate different levels of information. I don't tell them if the myth is true or wrong. For example, with the vaginal microbiome group, I didn't have any influence on it. I just basically told them to go and pick their own references and evaluate that as a topic. Is there strengths in it? Are there weaknesses? And report them in a way that someone can make their own type of conclusion. And they seem to have a really good time with doing that. And I have a great time hearing about their experiences as they're working through that.
I think having a group of students do that is really important as well, because I'm guessing there'll be differences among the members of each group with their interpretation of things. And so this helps build something like consensus in the group.
Yes. So I try to, again, I have little intricate motives in there. I do this course. It's an upper level course. It's supposed to be to help them get ready for professional school, graduate school. And in my experience, I couldn't have survived graduate school without being able to work with my cohort and understand how to work together, right? It was just, it's too much of a massive information and overload to try to do that in a silo and maintain any type of sanity or humanity, I feel like. So I try to get them to start learning how to work together as groups, how to build that camaraderie, and how to deal with when we all have differing ideas of how to approach things. Because when it comes to
Mm.
the podcast, like you mentioned, students have different levels of wanting to engage, right? I have some students who are not very creative at all. They're they're just here to check this off their to-do list and go on to the next thing. Have other students who are like, I love doing social media. I love doing this type of creative work. I want to put a lot of effort into it. And they have to figure out how to balance that. They have to figure out, I like this topic or I like this paper. I think it's more substantial for supporting the evidence than this paper. What do we do as a group? And typically I try to tell them, try to appoint someone who can help navigate and solve those things and also come up with certain rules for this is how things are going to flow. And if we deviate from these rules, this is what we need to do to try to address it. Um, Again, just throwing in as many skills and learning things as I can into this one assignment without the students getting too wise to me, I think. Or maybe they are and I haven't caught on to them yet. Who knows?
Well, on the subject of kind of pedagogical ulterior motives, for lack of a better expression, but it's true. When students ask for a study guide,
Mhm.
truthfully, we're scamming them because you give them some enormous number of questions and it's what you want them to know anyway.
Mhm.
So they think they're kind of like really narrowing things down, but in fact, you're helping them. It's like in many classes, that 3x5 or 5x7 card, you can write whatever
Yes.
you want on it. The process of doing it
Mhm.
imprints your mind. So you often don't even need the card.
Yes.
And there's nothing wrong with this because so many students feel like they have to hop over various barriers. And so they're just like, as you say, checking off a box.
And so I think I
I did have
definitely agree with you on that one. I wholeheartedly agree with everything you just said there.
well, I mean, it's something we hope for. And I have an expression and I wanted to share it with you. I call it the 10-80-10 rule.
Mhm.
And this is a really sad thing, Jess. And again, if you have a different experience, that's completely valid. But I find that 10% of my students are going to excel no matter what I do. And 10% of the students are going to have real troubles no matter what I do.
Mhm.
Now, we all love that 10% that excel because that strokes our delicate little egos. And we really worry about the 10% that are having trouble because we want to help people,
Mhm.
but we ignore that 80%. And especially as I've grown older as an educator, I've become more and more concerned with that 80% because they're the ones where my effort can really help them. I mean,
Mhm.
trust me, I'm going to still try and help the 10% that are having trouble, and I'm going to stroke my delicate little ego about the upper 10% too. But I tend to think a lot of us forget that 80%, and this is where group work, I think, really shines
Mhm.
because you're almost certainly going to have like different kinds of people. Can I ask a few questions mechanically or mechanistically about your course?
Sure, sure.
How do you assign groups?
So, whenever students enroll, we get their kind of student history to let us know, what things that they performed well in, what things that other professors think they may need assistance with. And so I somewhat pair those overachievers with those students who may have struggled in the past. And what I've noticed happens is that the overachievers, they have to, which I had to do the same thing, learn to temper their expectations. But then those students who sometimes struggle, there's certain levels of pressure, that additional pressure that come along with group work, right? Like it's one thing if you let yourself down. It's another thing if you let the group down. It's another thing if you let the group down and the rest of the class can tell you let the group down, right? And so it kind of forces those students to perform a little bit better. And I
Mhm.
see those students actually do a lot better in my class than they have in some of their other elective courses for microbiology. Well, not for microbiology, but their other elective courses for
Mhm.
biology in general.
I think that this is really important because when I've had uh, group lab reports, for example, eh, there's no real. I want to find the right terminology for this. You
Mhm.
put it so eloquently, and I don't want to just repeat your words, but when everybody is up front with the group project, everyone can see what everyone's done.
Mhm.
That's a self-correcting issue because people really don't want to let everyone down and be seen doing that.
Mhm.
Now, of course, there can be problems and you have to address those problems. There can be group dynamics that don't work out. All of that is true. And I'm sure that you've seen the experience where one person just doesn't do their job and the rest of the group is concerned about that. But honestly, I think something similar to that happens no matter what modality you use.
Yes.
Something similar, unless everyone has a blue book and that's it, right? And we're better than that. And so are they.
Yes. And also, I think it helps with some of that real world preparation as well. Science it's a team science thing, right? If you want that really nice paper, it's a team science thing. You have to collaborate with people internally, externally, and sometimes the work methods, the work like it's just going to differ. Personalities differ, and so really learning and developing that skill, especially with one of the things about Spelman, like you mentioned, it's a small college. Everybody knows each other for the most part. So it's an environment where it's kind of less stress with figuring this out, right? It's more at Spelman, we call all the students sisters. So it's kind of almost like a sibling dynamic when we're working things out, which can be positive and negative as a professor to have to deal with. But I think the students really do a pretty good job because they're already so familiar with one another of how to troubleshoot through differences. But like you said, differences do happen, and I have to step in as a professor and try my best to help them alleviate those.
I think sometimes we put on, I don't know, like either very blurry glasses or electron microscope glasses, where we tend to focus on things that are minor but aren't perfect and lose sight of how the whole system is working well. And I come back to something that you yourself have said, that no matter what we try, there are going to be pros and cons, period. And that's why, in my own experience at small colleges, I have always supported different approaches. I don't think there's one way to do almost anything. Other than like study gravity, right? That's about it, right? But you know what I'm getting at there. And so I really like what you're saying here. And so your audience, as I understand it, is supposed to be a non-STEM person. I really, really like that a lot. I love the fact that you're giving them a couple of examples of solid podcasts, and that so they know what to model on, and then and then they go find their other one, and then they select their topics. So I think you started to do this. Can you give listeners and viewers an idea of the kinds of topics that your classes has decided to investigate through podcasting?
Of course, of course. So we've done this for 2 semesters now. Some of the topics that we had were things like, if I use mouthwash, does it get rid of all the bacteria in my mouth? How often should I wash my ears? Is COVID considered a neurological, or could COVID be considered a neurological disease? Is it possible to cure HIV with a shot? What health equity may be connected to that? I also had groups who connected the idea of what happens with sexually transmitted diseases and eye infections, whether that be through a transvaginal birth or whether that be through immunocompromised infections that can happen. And then finally, they looked at H5N1 with bird flu because it's something that's been coming up on the news. They said they want to do it so that they could really, because I do this assignment right before they go home for Thanksgiving break. So right before they're about to start talking with their family members, or their family members are about to say something like, oh, if you take vitamin C every day for the rest of your life, you'll never get a cold. Like those types of things might come up, right? And so hopefully these topics will help them with some of that post-Thanksgiving conversation before it gets cut off.
No, I really like this because I want to say, are you familiar with Nancy Borey's NSF grant on podcasting?
No, not at all. This is completely new to me.
So I'm going to put a link to it in the show notes. But what Nancy did is get a group of scientists together, and what they're doing in their classroom is, and they're using This Week in Microbiology. The
Yes.
whole idea is to teach students how to read scientific papers. And that's the goal. And it
Mhm.
works very well for them. And that is a really important skill. Now, this is different than your own approach, which I like very much as well, where they're taking questions that might occur. I don't want to pick on grandmas, right?
Yes.
But like your family member at home, right? And again, when you start to pick an individual, then some folks say, "Oh, don't do that." I just come back to a non-STEM person is what I do.
Yes.
And when, what kinds of concerns do they have? Because people have unusual ideas about the microbial world. I mean, a really good example is your toothbrush in the bathroom, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
That could open up a
And
lot
see,
of
I get so delighted by stuff like this. And there's such an important place for the ability to do that. So you've had some really good ideas. I like the way that and I guess the word I'm looking for is scaffolding the assignment,
Mhm.
because that seems to work well. So, and do you have a way of dealing with interpersonal challenges, or do you step back and let them work that out?
So traditionally, I kind of stepped back and let them work that out. In my most recent semester, I did have a situation though where stepping back and letting them work it out was not going to be something to solve the situation well enough. So that was a first for me to kind of learn how to work through and adjust for in the future. It was basically just ended up having to kind of reassign groups a little bit and everything was fine moving forward. But
Sure.
it was just one of those situations that was relatively new. And so as a young professor, that was something that was kind of, I will say, a challenge for me in the classroom this semester was figuring out, okay, I've never experienced this. So now I have to show the students that this is something new for me. How do we handle new challenges and do so in a way that's conducive with this being a very productive class? Because we don't want to disrupt the other students either. Um,
No. I think a lot of it comes to, and I'm going to call it an educational culture. You want to encourage a culture of support, and I've seen it happen. I mean, a really good example from my own experience is when I had, and this surely doesn't happen to you. You're quite dynamic, but when you have the intro class and the student is zoning out, are you familiar with the type?
I,
And so I would say, and I would become more animated to try and draw the person back in as I'm stalking back and forth in front of because it's about 40 people in this class. And then I said, so you should probably write this down. And the student's just staring off into space. And then I finally say, you, and I name the student, should write this down. And he looks at me and he says, I don't have a pencil. And before I responded, 4 people offered him pencils.
oh, look at that.
Nobody laughed. Nobody poked fun. It was one of the best experiences I can think of because they all are in it together. And they really are. Now, that's in a class of 40. When you have this working group together where they have a product and they have a path to get that product out here, it's just exactly like the kind of team building that you would see in any company. So it's a real life skill, as you've mentioned. That's an amazing story.
And some of them, they
So
come out of it with the camaraderie and friendships. I have like a few that like, you know, they're taking classes together in next semesters. They're continuing to work on research projects. And so for some of them, it really does help them better bond with their classmates, especially, like I said, a lot of them junior year, senior year, they got some tough classes. They need to be able to have those work groups and those, that support system to get through it.
And secretly, you have taught them that working together helps.
I hope so. I hope when they leave, or even in a few years when they look back, they're like, you know what? Working together does make it work a little bit better sometimes.
It does. So do you have some more stories or some more thoughts about this particular approach? Perhaps a challenge that you had to face or a success that you'd like to share?
So I could definitely say a challenge that I had to face that hopefully we will triumph it into a success. How are we going to record the podcast? Was something that students ask quite a bit, right? How are we going to record the podcast? At that particular time, we had relatively limited resources. So it's okay. You can do it on Zoom. You can do it this way. You might have to record and edit this, those types of things. And you have a short amount of time. as well, because Dr. Coates is only giving you a week between each deadline of when something is due. So it's not a whole bunch of time to figure these things out. So that was an initial challenge for us. A lot of the students, they decided to record on Zoom, and they either saved the audio, and some of them actually decided to save the audio and the video for their podcast. I hope in semesters to come that will change because at Spelman, we've recently partnered with Spotify to have our own podcast center so that the students, if they have any podcast ideas, they can record them there. So I think as the production has to be less responsibility of the student and it's something that I can take over more in the class, that'll be a really wonderful thing for us as we move forward, and hopefully even branch out as far as the types of skills that students can leave the classroom with.
One challenge that I've seen when I have students that make YouTube videos or make audios or whatever, especially in recent years, is students did not wish their names used to be used. And that's 100% okay. And it's a really important issue to navigate because sometimes students hear things that you're not saying. And for example, I absolutely am sympathetic to whatever a student wants to do about issues of privacy. I really am. But they're afraid I won't like it. And, one of the things that I fight with a lot is none of us can mind read, and it's a good thing that we can't mind read. Right? Yes. And a lot of us project things onto others. So have you had this experience? Well, first off, do you make these recordings, these podcasts that you're doing, are they just in-house or are you submitting them to the big world out there?
Right now they're just in-house, but moving forward, I would like to have some sort of method to possibly have it for the greater world. Right now, I just have it as something that students can include in their own portfolios, as well as if they want to add like a little tagline to their resume. I made a podcast in my micro class. They can do that. But because of the privacy concerns, I wasn't sure how to go about showcasing the wonderful things. Because if you all could hear some of these podcasts, I've loved them to death. And I think they'd be really nice for other people to hear, but how to handle that is something that I'm still trying to figure out in the classroom.
It's really true. I don't know. Maybe it's the world. I was going to say, I don't know who damaged some of these students, their self-esteem. People make a joke about students having too much self-esteem. I don't think that's true. I have students routinely who say that they're not artistic, and I could walk you down to my lab and show you a laboratory filled with the artwork that they created. And you would be just bowled over by it. I have been so impressed in so many ways. But I used to think it was kind of like false modesty, kind of psychologically Amish. You don't want to praise yourself in any way. But in fact, it's genuine. And I'm sure you've had the experience I'm going to tell you now where a student does really well on an exam. And you say to them in private, you did really well on that exam. And they look down and they say, I was lucky. And then I tell them, did you work hard? Well, yes. I said, then you can be proud of doing well. That's not luck. It's you.
You did exactly.
And I think that factors a little bit into it. To be fair, there are some deeply strange people on social media. Let's be clear about that. So anytime a student wants to be private, I'm 100% approving of that. But some of the things that students have done, I've seen wonderful videos that students have done about horizontal gene transfer. But I had a student who did actually a very hysterical video about the fermented food natto.
Oh.
Because she liked it. And so what happened is she was talking about natto, and then they would break away to a photograph and they'd come back to her and she would have more yarn in her hair because that's how natto looks. Okay. And by the end of it, she was just covered in the yarn, and it was just hysterical, but she absolutely did not want that one released.
Aww.
And why would I fight about something like that? Right. I mean, it's their creativity. But I hope that she took that level of creativity and did more with it, because really is worthwhile. I mean, as I face retirement, that's the thing that really upsets me, so that they're all so worthwhile and they all have interesting things to say.
And,
I got myself going. Sorry about that.
No. I love this because this is something that I've really tried to do in the classroom as well. You kind of mentioned the idea of instilling confidence in the students. A lot of times, whether it be lab, the podcast, preparing for exams, students like to ask me questions instead of tell me stuff. Yeah. And so I got to the point in the classroom where I'd be like, all right, what do you think? And they're like, Dr. Coates, that's not fair. I was like, no, I want you to start telling me instead of asking me, because so far, every time you've asked me, you've been correct. You haven't gotten anything incorrect yet, or if you were a little bit incorrect, it wasn't so far off base that I was worried about you and why you were in the class. So now I need you to start telling me stuff, and I'll verify it. If you're wrong, I'll tell you you're wrong. That's my job. I'll let you know. But I want you now to start walking and talking like a microbiology expert. You don't have a PhD, but you do have more knowledge than the average person, which makes you an expert on a topic, right? You don't have to have a doctorate to be an expert. You just have to know a topic a little bit better than the general person. And I can guarantee you they know it better than the general person, right? Because they've studied hard and they've done the work that they need to do. So now I just want them to exude that confidence a little bit more.
You know, it's funny. The three most important words in science are "I don't know." Yes. Because that's not a judgment, it's an opportunity. And I can't tell you, someone has been making a buzzer sound when people say things. Do you know what I mean? So that they are afraid to say things. And they shouldn't be, because, you know, I've been asked questions many times that no one knows the answer to. And I get a big smile on my face because they're doing the right thinking. And they need to feel that way too. Now, there's a difference between someone who's, you know, just not doing the work, but that's mostly not the case.
Exactly.
So you mentioned that you've been fighting microbial misconceptions a little bit with the podcast, and it sounds like a lot of the choices for the podcasts are in that area. For example, mouthwash and oral microbes. And it's interesting to me because I could see that as a project that students would want to do in the lab, which I wouldn't recommend for all kinds of reasons. So what kinds of misconceptions have you all dealt with that have been successful?
So we haven't actually tested, maybe have tested possibly one of the misconceptions lab-wise. A student did it as, so any student who takes the microbiology course, we have our general labs, but they also have the option of doing independent research to submit for our annual research day at Spelman College. And so one student in particular, this is again, this idea of the vaginal microbiome, she was interested in how boric acid can inhibit bacterial growth. So we couldn't, of course, use any human microbes because we're a BSL-1 lab for the most part, but we have some pretty safe alternatives. And so we had to go through the process of how do you make stocks, dissolving them so that we can put them on the little filter disc so that we could be able to do the zones of inhibition, what's a lawn, how to spread cells, all those really wonderful things, and have her sit down and think about, okay, well, what does this mean and how does this translate to the bigger idea of disrupting that vaginal microbiome? What could possibly happen? That student is now in the process of applying to MPH programs. When she initially came into the course, she was a fifth-year senior, so she wasn't really sure anymore about what she wanted to do. She didn't think med school was her thing anymore, but she still wanted to do something healthcare related. And so we got to do the podcast, and also we do a little bit of epi at the end. And she felt like that was something that she wanted to continue with. So now she's applying to MPH programs, and hopefully I'll be getting a really wonderful email soon that says, "Hi, Dr. Coates, I got accepted," so that we can celebrate. So,
well, I'm crossing my fingers for that, because that is the greatest result, the greatest outcome. And I don't mean that everyone has to get a PhD or an MPH or anything. I'm just saying where what you taught them helps them in terms of the direction they want to go in their life.
Exactly.
And that is the greatest benefit of being an educator.
Yes, it's a very rewarding feeling to have that. So I'm excited for all the students.
So, Jess, there are all kinds of podcasts out there, say about history or, not necessarily science is my point. There are all kinds of podcasts about history or about sociology. How do you work with these students to learn how to filter their sources because of the amount of stuff that, I'm going to be very polite here, are not fully accurate?
Mhm. So I will say we do this as a very small portion of the course. I wish we had more time, but I think I'd have to end up teaching a 2 semester course probably. But one thing that we do is we look at case studies. We look at case studies and I explain to them what a case study means. I'm saying this is a case that was seen medically. It's not the most common, hasn't been repeated a lot of times in the literature. And then I use that as a segue to go back to some of the previous types of literature they've encountered in their other biology courses. So how is this different from the primary literature that you probably read in your molecular biology course? How is this different from the New York Times article you read in your science communication course? And where do we place their level of scientific integrity and rigor as far as what they can allow us to answer and talk about? And so that's just one really short portion of a lecture to introduce that to them. But my goal is for them to be able to say, okay, there's different hierarchies of information, and I want to find a good balance. Like that case study might be really good to grab someone's attention, right? Because you hear something like, person with staph ends up with brain infection. You just hear something that's very, very eye-catching for you. So that can bring people in to listen to the podcast, but maybe you need scientific literature and some primary literature to back that up so that you have a really strong argument in what you're talking about. And so I try to get them to do that in their podcast, find things that are interesting that might not be the highest level of integrity, and then bring in scientific literature to either support or debunk that idea as their whole kind of objective.
It's a very challenging thing to do because there's something in the students, and I think it's in the public, that likes authority to be brought down. So when things are presented as authority, they have a knee-jerk reaction. They want to accept challenges to authority. And I don't know what that is, but it's always been there to some degree. And a good example is when I talk about, you're familiar with the 10-to-1 microbial cells to human cells concept. And it turns out that particular study is inaccurate. When you go look for the estimates, you find out that someone basically made it up and put it in a review paper, and everyone started quoting it. And I find that endlessly amusing because as soon as I first heard about 10-to-1, I would think, well, how would you know that? And that's a good thing for students to think about, but they sometimes take it too far. So the only solution that I think we have to this is teaching them to evaluate primary literature and what peer review means and things of that nature. And certainly any time that one goes to YouTube or the internet in general, there are some strange things there.
Oh, yes, there are some definitely. And the fact checking is being removed from a lot of these sites. So it's even more, imperative to be able to evaluate what's actually realistic and what's not.
So, Jess, another question that occurs to me is that in the various approaches across 2 semesters, were there some common approaches that students had to their podcast projects, or were there some unusual approaches that were taken by some?
I don't know if I would say unusual, but I will say each group interprets the assignment completely different. And what it means to make a podcast that is engaging comes out differently for each group. Because we'll have some groups, I give them the option. I say you can do an oral one, you can do visual. It's your choice. You make those own creative decisions. And when they make those creative decisions, it can look so different. We have some, they play games. They pretend like one person is an invited expert and they do an interview style. There's others that they pretend like they're on a news show and they're giving a news report. I've had visuals where it was like podcasting, kind of animation based. And so like just that interpretation alone, I think varies from each group. And it's really exciting to see where they go in that creative direction. Outside of In Common, like when it comes to In Common, I think just the fact that they all submit the same type of file on the same day. That's about the only thing they have in common, but how they interpret the assignment, it can vary from group to group.
And you see, this is a really good thing. There's a proverb in Zen Buddhism that the nail that stands up gets hammered down. And that idea of uniformity has always worried me because, well, I'm a little different myself. But the fact of the matter is, I want students, and I think you do too, from what you're telling me, to have their approach, because that ownership is what drives this project.
So they own it. When I give them the element of their own ownership, they work harder than I expect them to work. You know, if it's something that
Yes,
they really enjoy and they're motivated by, they put in more work on their own without me even having, to ask or put those requirements out there for them.
absolutely.
And they don't
Thank
forget
you.
the material either. They don't. They're like, that podcast that we had to
Yeah.
do, like, there's little things that they never seem to forget from it, or at least in the past 2 years, they haven't forgotten yet. So.
Yeah, because it's theirs. So I'd like to take a couple of minutes before we close out, and I'd like you to talk about your path to the microbial sciences. We talked about this before it started, and you are self-deprecating by nature, and I suffer from that too. So we'll get through it together.
Well, I will say my journey into microbiology actually started as a senior taking an 8 a.m. class. I ended up taking parasitology my senior year. And at the exact same time as taking parasitology, I adopted a dog. And so we start talking about worms and I adopted him from the pound. So he came with quite a few microbes. He came home with quite a few microbes. So we're talking about all these things at an 8 a.m. I have a dog at home. He's in my little small college student apartment. So we have a lot of shared space basically. And so it really grabbed my interest to learn not only about those microbes, but more that we learned in the class. So I decided to go ahead when I applied to my PhD programs. I did umbrella programs where I could have the opportunity to rotate into micro labs. I rotate into the micro labs and I come to realize bench science is a very, very acquired skill. And it takes a lot of mental toughness as well. And I found myself being very anxious and overwhelmed at the bench. I think I put a little bit too much pressure as far as the gravity of mistakes at the bench because it felt like it came with a really massive price tag sometimes. So I slowly found myself easing into computational biology where I felt a little bit more comfortable with if you make a mistake, guess what? Just rerun the program. No, nothing really gets impacted too much. But when you're in a micro program with more traditional bench scientists and you're only doing computational work, they always ask the same thing. Well, how can you validate this? So I couldn't get out of the program without figuring out how to do experiments to validate it. So I do my experiments, I graduate, people are like, oh, wow, this is really useful. You can do both sides. You can program and you can, work at the bench. So where do you want to apply that to? And I don't know. I have no idea because I've just been focusing on how to finish my PhD. So I did a lot of floating. I contracted at the CDC for a little bit, right before the COVID-19 pandemic hit, doing some stuff on Zika and measles. So that was fun, switching from bacteria to viruses and getting to dive into that. I took a small break and went into the tech world at IBM and did a visiting position in racial and social justice, but focused in on like public health problems and how we can use technology to potentially solve those. And then ultimately, I decided to come back to academia. Just because, academia gives you opportunity, the academic freedom is an amazing thing to explore different types of questions. And then engaging with the students is such a really wonderful part of that process. So now I'm at Spelman, I'm lecturing in microbiology, and then I've also started doing some independent research with students who might be interested in more computational and analytical projects as they relate to micro. So it's been a wonderful experience. If you would have asked me in 2013, 2009, whenever I graduated high school, college, all these different stages, that this is what I'd be doing right now, I don't know if I would laugh at you, but I'm pretty sure I'd be like, oh, that person doesn't know what they're talking about, and just kind of, keep going. But now I think all these experiences have really come together, and they give me a really great opportunity to help the students as they're figuring out their next path.
I think that's really important. And I want to say that there are lots of different paths. I mean, I make a joke about this, and I can be flippant and serious at the same time. It's like this, but just as some things are described as being part of a big tent, I would say that what we have in the microbial sciences is a big petri dish.
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean by that is there are lots of different approaches, and I can't tell you the number of times that I've been told by undergraduate students what science is, when they really don't know the depth and the breadth and the diversity on all different meanings of that word that's possible. And so what I try to do on the podcast is show different people with different approaches and different routes. And if nothing else, I want listeners and viewers to see that there are many different approaches. I myself spent about almost 10 years in biotech before returning to academia. I really didn't like my version of biotech, I'm just saying. Because I love doing simple experiments. I love having questions that occur to me and finding out the answer. I adore talking to students. Once you break them down where they feel comfortable talking to you about what they think, I always learn something about my own field from them. And so you're an excellent example of the kind of mentor that will make a huge difference in these students' lives.
Well, thank you.
So you're to be commended. Sure. And I really appreciate, your being here on the podcast today. I will say that your idea about podcasting to address various concerns that students have about microbial issues is fascinating, because it's not a matter of learning how to read papers. It's not a matter of investigating a particular type 6 secretory system or something similar. It's not even about here's this interesting microbe I want to tell you about. It's about things that actually impact everyday life. And my father and mother, I'm first generation college. My late father and my late mother. My father was a firefighter. Before that, he was a truck driver. My mother was a filing clerk and a stay-at-home mom. They had no idea what the science business was. So I had a perfect audience for trying to explain science to people that didn't have the background. And I still remember my father not believing that I had a training grant for my PhD. That was it was so foreign to him. Yeah, it was so foreign to him. So that's the take-home message. Yeah, exactly so. And there's nothing wrong with any of those backgrounds, because science is a human profession. I want to say one final thing. I collect buttons. I have a problem as I'm looking at all of them. My wife will tell you I have a problem among the problems I have. And I have one that says human and humane.
Okay.
And it's possible, to be very humane about what we're doing in education or in science, and not recognize that we're also just human beings doing it. So I really like that idea. And that's one thing that students help with. They keep you grounded.
They definitely keep you grounded. This podcast idea, it's a new idea. It's a developing idea. They are very willing to give you any critiques that they have as far as adjustments for the class. So I always appreciate that. I try to tell them, I want to have an open environment where you can communicate how you feel. It doesn't mean I'm going to automatically change the course, but I will give you the space to always feel comfortable to communicate that. And I'll take it into consideration as we're moving forward. And so I think I'm really interested in hearing their ideas as well as yours or anyone else's, as far as how we can really refine this and make it a wonderful experience for all the students.
We had a diversity consultant in my department a few years ago, and she said something that I've really taken to heart. She herself did not care for the term safe space. I understand what it means, but she said that what she preferred was the term brave space. And I like that a lot, where everyone in the group feels brave enough to talk about how they're feeling and what they're experiencing. And it's such a delicate walk as an educator, and it sounds like you've done wonderfully.
Just learning and trying each day. This is my second year, so I know there's a lot of growth still to come, but just trying each semester to get better and better.
Well, I really appreciated your time. What is the name of your dog?
My dog's name is Poppy, like the seed.
So would you give Poppy a pet for me, please?
Oh, of course. He will love that.
Yeah, I'm a big dog lover. And I want to thank you again for your time on the podcast with us today.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
It's a pleasure meeting you. This has been Matters Microbial, a weekly podcast about the wonders of our microbial world and the people who study it. You can send questions, suggestions, or comments to me at mattersmicrobial@gmail.com. Show notes from today's episode, with wonderful links, can be found at microbe.tv/mm. If you like our work, please consider supporting us at microbe.tv/contribute. I'm Doc Martin, and you can find me in the biology department of the University of Puget Sound in Tacoma, Washington. Dr. Jessica Coates is in the biology department at Spelman College in Atlanta, Georgia. Many thanks, as always, to David Renata for superb editing and Reber Clark for the wonderfully quirky music. I hope that you've all enjoyed being part of our quality quorum for today. See you next time on Matters Microbial.